At 5:47 on the morning of June 12, 1982, Harold Watkins stood in his backyard in rural Ohio, staring at 3 acres of land he couldn't afford to keep. 65 years old, 8 months behind on property taxes, 0 income since the steel mill closed. The bank had sent final notice: foreclosure in 90 days. His wife Martha had stopped speaking to him about money. His 3 grown children had offered to let him move in with them, sell the property, admit defeat. Harold picked up his shovel and started digging. The problem had started with the mill closure. Youngstown Steel had employed 4,200 workers. Harold had worked there for 31 years. Furnace operator, steady paycheck, union benefits. In September 1981, the mill shut down. No warning, no severance, no pension. The company declared bankruptcy. Harold's retirement fund vanished with it. He'd tried finding other work. At 65, nobody was hiring. The regional unemployment rate hit 23%. Younger men with families were competing for minimum wage positions. Harold couldn't get interviews at McDonald's. He applied to 47 jobs in 5 months. 0 callbacks. His savings lasted until February 1982. Then Martha's medical bills started coming. She had rheumatoid arthritis, needed medication that cost $340 per month. They had no insurance. The prescriptions ate through what little money remained. By May, they were down to $180 in their checking account and $2,400 in property taxes they couldn't pay. The 3 acres behind their house had been unused for decades. Previous owner had kept horses, built a barn that now sagged with rot. The land was flat, well-drained, good soil. Harold had grown up on a farm in Kentucky. His father had raised tobacco, corn, vegetables. Harold knew how to work land, he just hadn't done it in 40 years. In June 1982, he made a decision that would either save them or waste the last energy he had left. He would grow vegetables and sell them, not at a grocery store, they wouldn't buy from him, at a roadside stand, direct to customers, cash only. He started with what he had: no money for seeds, no money for tools, no money for fertilizer. He found a rusted cultivator in the barn. He sharpened it using a file from his workshop. He borrowed a neighbor's tiller in exchange for promising to till the neighbor's garden next spring. He collected seeds from Martha's kitchen vegetables, tomato seeds from fresh tomatoes, pepper seeds from bell peppers, bean seeds from dried beans in the pantry. He cleared half an acre, back-breaking work for a 65-year-old man, removing rocks, turning soil, building rows. It took him 11 days. His hands blistered, his back seized up so badly he couldn't stand upright for 3 days. Martha told him he was killing himself. He kept digging. He planted everything he had seeds for: tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, cucumbers. He hand-watered from the well using buckets. No irrigation system, couldn't afford one. 2 hours every morning carrying water. The plants grew slowly at first, then exploded. Ohio summer heat, consistent watering, decent soil. By mid-July, he had vegetables. The roadside stand was a plywood sheet balanced on sawhorses. He built it at the end of his driveway on Route 45, a county road that carried 800 cars per day. He hand-painted a sign: fresh vegetables. He picked tomatoes at dawn, arranged them on the plywood, sat in a folding chair, waiting for customers. The first day, he sold nothing. People drove past without slowing. The second day, 1 car stopped. Elderly woman bought 3 tomatoes for $1.50. Harold went home with $1.50. It wasn't enough. He needed $2,400 by September. The third day, 6 customers, $14 in sales. Fourth day, 11 customers, $31. Word was spreading. The tomatoes were good, noticeably better than grocery store produce. Harold's tomatoes were vine-ripened, picked the morning they were sold. Supermarket tomatoes were picked green, ripened in warehouses, tasted like nothing. People noticed the difference. By August, Harold was selling $60 to $80 per day. He expanded the garden. He planted late-season crops, fall vegetables. He added cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. The roadside stand evolved. He built a proper structure using reclaimed barn wood. He added shelves, improved the display, made it look professional. Customers started asking for specific items. Could he grow sweet corn? Could he get fresh eggs? Could he source honey? Harold couldn't grow everything they wanted, but he knew people who could. His neighbor kept chickens. Another neighbor had beehives. Harold became a middleman. He sold their eggs and honey at his stand, took a 30% commission. The neighbor got access to Harold's customer base. Harold got additional revenue without additional work. September came. Harold had made $2,890 from vegetable sales, enough to pay the property taxes with $490 remaining. He walked into the county tax office, paid in cash, got a receipt. The property was safe for another year. But winter was coming. The garden would die. He needed a plan for sustainable year-round income. He started preserving food, canning tomatoes, pickling cucumbers, making relishes and jams. Martha knew how to can. She'd learned from her mother. They worked together in the kitchen. She handled the canning process. He grew the vegetables. They made 340 jars of preserved food in October. Harold added the preserved foods to his roadside stand. Canned tomatoes for $4 per quart jar, pickles for $5, strawberry jam for $6. The margins were better than fresh produce. A quart of canned tomatoes cost Harold $0.70 in materials and labor, sold for $4. He was making $3.30 profit per jar. The preserved food sold faster than he expected. Customers preferred homemade canned goods over store-bought. The quality was obvious. By November, all 340 jars were gone. Harold had made $1,480 in preserved food sales alone. He was learning business fundamentals through trial and error. Customer acquisition cost was zero. People drove past his stand naturally. His overhead was minimal. No rent, no employees, no storefront. His only costs were seeds, jars, and labor. Everything else was profit. Winter 1982. Harold built a root cellar. He dug an 8-foot-deep hole behind the barn, lined it with concrete blocks, added ventilation. The root cellar maintained 35-degree temperature year-round without electricity. He could store potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets for months. Fresh vegetables in winter, when supermarket prices were highest. He planted storage crops in September, specifically for winter sales. 600 pounds of potatoes, 400 pounds of carrots, 200 pounds of winter squash. He harvested them in October, stored them in the root cellar, sold them through winter at premium prices. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost Harold 30 cents to grow, sold for $3.50 in January. The markup was enormous. By spring 1983, Harold had cleared $4,200 in profit. Not enough to live comfortably, but enough to survive. He expanded the operation. He cultivated the full 3 acres. He built a second, larger roadside stand. He started taking pre-orders from customers. They'd call his house, tell him what they wanted, he'd have it ready when they stopped by. The business was growing faster than he could manage alone. Martha started helping full-time. She handled canning, customer service, bookkeeping. Harold focused on growing and harvesting. They worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. It was exhausting, but it was working. Summer 1983, a restaurant owner stopped at the stand. Small Italian restaurant in Youngstown, 15 miles away. The chef wanted fresh vegetables for his kitchen. Could Harold supply them? The chef needed 50 pounds of tomatoes per week, 20 pounds of peppers, 15 pounds of onions. Consistent quality, reliable delivery. Harold said yes without knowing if he could fulfill it. He planted additional crops specifically for the restaurant. He bought a used pickup truck for $800 to handle deliveries. Every Tuesday and Friday, he drove to Youngstown with produce. The restaurant paid net 30 terms, $180 per delivery. The restaurant contract changed everything. Guaranteed income, predictable revenue. Harold started pursuing more restaurant clients. By fall 1983, he had 4 restaurants buying from him. Combined revenue, $680 per week, $35,360 annually. That was more than he'd made at the steel mill. But restaurants demanded consistency. They needed supplies year-round. Harold couldn't grow fresh tomatoes in Ohio winters. He needed a greenhouse. A proper commercial greenhouse cost $40,000. He didn't have that kind of money. He built one himself. He used the barn structure as a base. He removed the old roof, built a new frame using 2x4 lumber, covered it with 6mm polyethylene sheeting. He installed a wood-burning stove for heat, salvaged from a demolished house. The whole greenhouse cost him $1,200 in materials and 6 weeks of hard labor. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. He grew lettuce, spinach, herbs through winter. The restaurants bought everything he could produce. Winter 1983-84, greenhouse revenue added another $4,800 to his income. By 1985, Harold's operation was generating $62,000 annually. He'd gone from near bankruptcy to comfortable middle-class income in 3 years. He employed 2 part-time workers, local teenagers who helped with harvesting and deliveries. He'd paid off all debt. He'd saved $18,000 in a bank account. The roadside stand had become a local landmark. People drove from 30 miles away specifically to buy from Harold. His reputation for quality was spreading. He was mentioned in the Youngstown newspaper. A local television station did a segment about his transformation from unemployed steelworker to successful farmer. The publicity created unexpected opportunities. A regional grocery chain contacted him. They wanted to stock his preserved foods in 23 stores. Could he supply them? The volume they needed was far beyond what he and Martha could produce in their kitchen. Harold faced a decision. He could stay small, keep operations manageable, maintain current income, or he could scale up, take risks, potentially multiply his income, but also his workload and stress. He chose to scale. He borrowed $15,000 from a local bank using his property as collateral. He built a commercial kitchen in the barn. He bought industrial canning equipment, commercial-grade kettles, a walk-in cooler. He hired Martha's sister to help with canning production. They went from producing 500 jars per year to 500 jars per week. The grocery chain deal launched in spring 1986. Harold's products appeared in 23 stores across 3 counties. Each store bought 60 jars per week. On average, that was 1,380 jars per week, 71,760 jars per year. At $2.50 wholesale price per jar, revenue was $179,400 annually from grocery stores alone. The production requirements were brutal. Harold's operation had grown from a one-man garden to a legitimate food business. He now employed 7 people full-time. The barn had been converted into a processing facility with commercial kitchen, packaging area, storage. He'd added a second greenhouse. The 3-acre property operated at maximum capacity. By 1988, Harold Watkins' business was generating $340,000 in annual revenue. After costs, his personal income was approximately $95,000. At 71 years old, he was making more money than he'd ever imagined possible. The man who'd faced foreclosure 6 years earlier now employed 12 people and supplied 47 restaurants and 31 grocery stores. This success created new challenges. Competition emerged. Other local farmers saw Harold's model and replicated it. Grocery stores started buying from multiple suppliers, driving down prices. Harold's margins compressed. He needed differentiation. He focused on premium products, specialty items that competitors couldn't easily replicate. He grew heirloom tomatoes, varieties that took longer to grow but tasted exceptional and sold for premium prices. He produced small-batch artisan jams with unusual flavor combinations: tomato basil jam, strawberry balsamic, peach bourbon. High-end restaurants loved them. He also invested in branding. Up until 1988, his products had no formal brand, just Harold's Vegetables handwritten on jars. He hired a local graphic designer, created proper labels, developed a logo. Watkins Farm, established in 1982, grown with pride in Ohio. The professional branding justified higher prices. By 1991, Harold was 74 years old. He'd built a business worth approximately $1.2 million, based on asset valuation, customer contracts, and consistent profitability. A regional food distributor offered to buy him out for $950,000. Harold accepted. The sale terms gave him $950,000 cash plus a 5-year consulting contract at $30,000 per year. The distributor kept the Watkins Farm brand, kept the employees, kept the operations exactly as Harold had built them. Harold stayed involved, but worked only 10 hours per week, mostly advising on growing and quality control. Total earnings from the business: $950,000 sale price plus approximately $720,000 cumulative profit from 1982 to 1991 operations. Harold had generated over $1.67 million from 3 acres and a roadside vegetable stand. He never moved from the property. He and Martha lived there until Martha passed in 1998. Harold continued maintaining a small personal garden, growing vegetables for family and neighbors. He never charged for them anymore. He'd made enough money. The garden was for love now, not survival. He died in 2003 at age 86. The Watkins Farm brand still exists today, now owned by a large agricultural corporation, but still producing preserved foods in Ohio using Harold's original recipes. The roadside stand where it all started was torn down in 2005 when Route 45 was expanded, but a historical marker was placed there noting its significance to local agricultural history. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about people who built extraordinary wealth from ordinary beginnings. Subscribe if you haven't already. Harold's legacy lives in the 12 people he employed, many of whom went on to start their own agricultural businesses. His model of direct-to-consumer farming combined with value-added products became a template studied by agricultural extension programs across the Midwest. Ohio State University created a case study about his business for their agricultural economics program. The lesson wasn't about gardening. It was about seeing opportunity where others saw only dirt, about working when others would have quit, about taking the only asset you have left and turning it into something worth $1 million. Harold Watkins saved his property with vegetables. Then he built a fortune with them. At 65 years old, with nothing but 3 acres and determination, he proved it was possible. That the real impact of Harold's work wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in what happened after he sold. The steel mill that had employed Harold never reopened. Youngstown lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs between 1977 and 1985. The city's population dropped by 1/3. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. The local economy collapsed so completely that national media called it the death of the American steel industry. But Harold's former employees didn't stay unemployed. Of the 12 people who worked for Watkins Farm at its peak, 9 started their own agricultural businesses within 5 years of Harold's sale. They'd learned from watching him. They'd seen how he transformed worthless land into revenue. They'd understood the business model. Now they replicated it. James Patterson had been Harold's first hire in 1984. Former steel worker, 52 years old when the mill closed, couldn't find work anywhere. Harold hired him to help with harvesting, paid him $8 per hour. Patterson worked for Harold for 7 years, saved every dollar he could, learned everything Harold taught him about growing and selling. In 1992, Patterson bought 5 acres outside Warren, Ohio, for $22,000. He grew specialty peppers, exotic varieties that restaurants were starting to request: ghost peppers, habaneros, poblanos. Harold had mentioned that restaurants were asking for them, but he didn't have space to grow specialty crops. Patterson filled that gap. His pepper business generated $78,000 in revenue the first year. By 1996, he was supplying 34 restaurants across Ohio and Pennsylvania. He employed 6 people. He eventually sold his operation in 2001 for $420,000. A former steelworker who'd been unemployable at 52 had built a near $500,000 business growing peppers. Sarah Chen was another employee. She'd worked in Watkins Farm's commercial kitchen from 1987 to 1991, handling canning and preservation. She was 38 when she started, a recent immigrant from Taiwan who spoke limited English. Harold hired her because she knew traditional preservation techniques that American workers didn't. She taught Harold's operation how to ferment vegetables, make kimchi, preserve using methods Harold had never encountered. Chen started her own business in 1993. She focused exclusively on Asian preserved vegetables, selling to the growing Asian immigrant population in Cleveland and Columbus. Her products filled a niche that didn't exist in American grocery stores. By 1998, she was distributing to 67 Asian markets across the Midwest. Revenue exceeded $200,000 annually. The pattern repeated across all of Harold's former employees. They'd learned a trade from him. More importantly, they'd learned that small-scale agriculture could generate real income in a region where manufacturing jobs had disappeared forever. They'd seen living proof that a single person with land and knowledge could build financial security. The ripple effect extended beyond Harold's direct employees. Other unemployed steelworkers in the region noticed what was happening. They saw Patterson's pepper farm thriving. They saw Chen's preservation business growing. They started asking questions. How did you start? What did it cost? Could I do this? By 1995, Mahoning County, Ohio, had 47 small agricultural businesses that hadn't existed in 1982. Most of them were started by former manufacturing workers who'd lost their jobs in the industrial collapse. They grew vegetables, raised chickens, kept bees, produced value-added foods. Collectively, they employed over 200 people and generated approximately $4.2 million in annual economic activity. The County Agricultural Extension Office started tracking the phenomenon. They called it post-industrial agriculture. Traditional farming had always existed in rural Ohio, but this was different. These weren't multi-generational farming families. These were former factory workers in their 50s and 60s who'd reinvented themselves as agricultural entrepreneurs. In 1997, Ohio State University sent researchers to study what was happening in Mahoning County. They interviewed 31 agricultural business owners. 28 of them cited Harold Watkins as their inspiration. They'd either worked for him directly, bought from his roadside stand, or heard his story through local news coverage. Harold had become a template for economic survival. The university published a report, Agricultural Entrepreneurship in Post-Industrial Communities. The report documented how small-scale farming could provide economic stability in regions devastated by manufacturing job losses. It was distributed to economic development offices across the Rust Belt. Politicians referenced it. Community organizations used it as a planning document. Harold's model spread beyond Ohio. Similar patterns emerged in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Indiana. Former automotive and steel workers started agricultural businesses. They grew specialty crops, produced artisan foods, sold directly to restaurants and consumers. The businesses were small, rarely exceeding $500,000 in annual revenue, but they were sustainable. They provided middle-class incomes in areas where those incomes had disappeared. By 2000, Harold was 83 years old and mostly retired. He still maintained a small garden, but the commercial operation had long since been sold. He'd become something of a local legend. The Agricultural Extension Office invited him to speak at workshops. Young farmers asked his advice. Economic development officials wanted to know how to replicate what had happened in Mahoning County. Harold's advice was always the same. Start small. Use what you have. Don't borrow more than you can afford to lose. Focus on quality over quantity. Build relationships with customers. Work harder than seems reasonable. Don't quit when it gets difficult. Simple advice, the kind of wisdom that sounds obvious until you try to implement it. But Harold had lived it. He had demonstrated that it worked. That credibility made his advice valuable. In 2002, a journalist from Cleveland came to interview Harold for a retrospective article about the Youngstown steel collapse and its aftermath. The article was titled, "What Came After the Mills." It profiled 5 people who'd rebuilt their lives after losing factory jobs. Harold was the centerpiece. The journalist asked Harold if he'd ever regretted leaving the steel mill. Harold thought about the question for a long time. Then he said something the journalist remembered for years. "The mill gave me 31 years of steady work. I'm grateful for that. But the mill also made me dependent. I never had to think about where my paycheck came from. I just showed up, did my job, went home. When the mill closed, I was helpless. I had no skills except operating a furnace. The garden taught me that I could create value with my own hands, that I didn't need a company to give me work. I could make my own work. That lesson was worth more than any paycheck." The article ran in February 2003. It generated significant regional interest. Agricultural programs across Ohio saw enrollment increases. Community colleges started offering courses in small-scale farming specifically designed for older adults transitioning from other careers. Harold died 7 months later, in September 2003. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless. He was 86. Martha had passed 5 years earlier. Their 3 children had all moved out of state, but they returned for the funeral. The funeral service was held at a small Methodist church in Youngstown. The church seated 200 people. Over 400 people showed up. They filled the church, stood in the aisles, gathered outside in the parking lot. Former employees, restaurant owners who'd bought from him, farmers who'd followed his model, customers who'd shopped at his roadside stand decades earlier. Harold Watkins gave a eulogy. He talked about being unemployed at 52, about feeling worthless after the mill closed, about Harold giving him a chance when nobody else would. He talked about learning to grow peppers, about Harold teaching him to test soil pH, about building his own business using Harold's principles. He ended by saying, "Harold Watkins saved my life. I'm not speaking metaphorically, he literally saved my life. I would have died broken and poor if he hadn't shown me another way to live." Several others spoke. Sarah Chen talked about Harold hiring her despite her limited English, about him respecting her knowledge even though she was an immigrant and a woman. A restaurant owner from Youngstown talked about Harold's integrity, how he never sold inferior produce, how his word was always good. A local county commissioner talked about Harold's economic impact, about the businesses he'd inspired, about the model he'd created for post-industrial communities. The local newspaper published an obituary that focused more on his business achievements than his personal life. Harold Watkins, 86, agricultural entrepreneur who transformed local economy. The obituary mentioned his work at the steel mill briefly, then spent 6 paragraphs detailing what he'd built after the mill closed. His children inherited the property. They sold it in 2004 for $240,000. The land was eventually developed into a small residential subdivision. The barn that had housed his commercial kitchen was torn down. The greenhouses were dismantled. The root cellar was filled in. No physical trace of Watkins' farm remains today except some old photographs and the historical marker on Route 45. But the business model survived. As of 2024, Mahoning County, Ohio, has over 90 small agricultural businesses. Most of them generate between $50,000 and $400,000 in annual revenue. Collectively, they employ approximately 340 people and contribute $8.7 million to the local economy. None of them would exist without Harold Watkins proving it was possible. The Watkins Farm brand continued for 18 years after Harold sold it. The regional distributor that bought the business maintained the brand, kept using Harold's recipes, continued producing in Ohio. In 2009, during the financial crisis, the distributor went bankrupt. The Watkins Farm brand was sold to a national food conglomerate. They moved production to a facility in Wisconsin, changed the recipes to reduce costs, expanded distribution to grocery stores nationwide. The products still exist. You can buy Watkins Farm preserved tomatoes in grocery stores across America today. The label still says established in 1982 and features a vintage illustration of a barn. But the connection to Harold is gone. Most people who buy the products have no idea who Harold Watkins was or what he built. That's probably fine. Harold never cared about fame. He cared about solving problems. In 1982, his problem was imminent foreclosure. He solved it by growing vegetables. The solution worked so well, it transformed into a business. The business worked so well, it became a model. The model worked so well, it changed how an entire region thought about economic survival. Harold Watkins turned 3 acres into $1 million. But more than that, he turned desperation into opportunity, unemployment into entrepreneurship, and personal survival into community transformation. He proved that at 65 years old, with no money and no prospects, you could still build something valuable. That lesson outlived the business. It outlived Harold himself. It's still teaching people today. If you've made it this far, drop a comment telling us what struck you most about Harold's story. Was it his refusal to quit? His willingness to work at 65? The way he created opportunity for others? Let us know. These conversations matter. They keep stories like Harold's alive. And if you know someone who's facing a difficult transition, someone who lost their job or their security, someone who thinks they're too old to start over, share this story with them. Not because it will magically solve their problems, but because it proves that starting over is possible. Harold Watkins did it. Others have done it. Maybe they can too.